before we get any deeper into history, I would like to address oppositional pathology and the esoteric sciences, because a lot of what we're talking about is what we see. And the thing about what we see often is how we see it defines what it is. And this a lot of the time comes around the esoteric concepts of archetypes and Carl Jung and Man and His Symbols, which was a book that Carl Jung wrote that basically describes the idea that without God to illuminate our symbols, man is in darkness. And with those symbols, we are able to reflect upon ourselves. It's actually the Sanskrit word guru means to come out of darkness into light. And generally, we have this concept of experts, and the word experts comes from experimenters who have navigated the path and have found their way out of the labyrinth, or at least have led us to the end results that they have found, which are the walls, the brick walls that they've not been able to escape. But if you look closer yourself and experiment, sometimes there are ways out of these walls, and these brick walls are actually just doors, and the keys to the buried treasure that are being guarded actually help us escape this system that we've been entrapped in for so long. It's because perspective and hubris is our perception, and it's a lens that we can share. And it usually starts like this. In the beginning, there's lots of bright, interesting energy, and we break it down. Patterns start to emerge. Often, and usually, we are taught which identities of patterns to notice from people that we trust. And when we start to see them open up, logos begin to form at what we call the delta point. And when the logos enter the psyche, then they became relationships in our youth. And we call this point the developmental psychology. Like, psychology is just the measurement of the symbols and the metrics in our minds and their use. In school, we're supposed to trust our leaders and our educators to teach us how to think and what behaviors are acceptable. And we're supposed to know that they're reliable sources. But if it turns out they're not, then we're supposed to rely on our own experiments in order that we don't become skewed and lose all credibility and faith in something greater than the heretics who've misrepresented and betrayed us and the subject itself that they have lied about. So we'll talk about chemistry later, but I want to introduce this quote from Yale chemist Professor Michael McBride. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, right? And again, experts are experimenters. So science is more than just existential allegory. It's experimentation, very, very much so. It's important that you be able to test something yourself. And at a point when people tell you that they are so well versed in experimentation that you don't need to, or that you can't experiment and try these experiments and become an expertise yourself, that might be, for lack of a better conspiracy, just because of conformational bias, is what I call it, because they want you to confirm and then conform both yourself and others to an agenda shifting pattern. And this is what scientists are taught to believe from a very early age is acceptable, because they know once they reach the point of no return that beyond the Socratic method of deductions that can be made through perceptions, and that there's only a range of consistent predictability. And beyond that range is the philosophy of empiricism and empirical observations, which is essentially a cult of perception. And while observances can be made, they can be augmented and are not trustworthy. So science falls into a philosophy of trust in illusions and a distrust in your own observations, which scientists have already been well informed that there are many ways to see things, and that right and wrong are merely points of view, and truth ranges between the pillars of falsity. So it's more important to see the bigger picture. And skeptics emerge and might say, in some predictable responses to scientists' predictable responses, I have seen, or I have read, or I have experimented, or at least my parents got me for Christmas that book on how things work. And the greatest threat to this conspiracy is someone getting their child a crystal radio kit and then putting it together and learning how things work, and then saying that they can see right through it, that they see a system, and in that system they find that there is a code, and it's been encoded. And this is actually where we get the word encoded, or coding, or coders, or programmers, because of tapestries, which were encoded with programs by code weavers, such as Penelope. So another way of looking at things is to say that these are some sort of intellectual fights that are happening for the sake of teaching us how we're supposed to view another perspective. And it's true that we can learn and wrestle with each other's perspectives, or you can be forced to see things a certain way. But if at some point someone tells you to see things that you have not been taught to see, or rather you've been taught not to see, it might seem less believable or hard to handle the truth beyond that range of acceptable belief and perception. This is where we get into this field of Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt is the German word which represents form or shape and perspective of that shape, because there are many ways to look at many shapes, and they're not all wrong. Some of them might not be better than others, but some might be better than others, depending on your values and your needs. So it is everyone's prerogative to try to see things their own way, at least to be able to see them differently and to find the way that is best to see them. And it's often we avoid that perception because we want to keep this rigid paradigm that is safe. But is it really? And where do we get it, right? It's usually something that starts the same way. We are to distrust ourselves. We are to believe we are worth less than ourselves. We are then to trust in these others who are, we believe, better than us and know more than us, because they've gone further in the labyrinth than we have, so we must trust them. So we make an arrangement and an agreement, and imprinting begins, and some sort of perception or perspective or philosophy is imprinted into you forever. And it's hard to remove, and it defines and shapes your pathology and your cognition forever. And it leads to what I call hypnotic reactionaries, where sort of like after MK Ultra, where Nazi scientists had pioneered mind control. And granted, it was an end game of mind control, but what was it really? It was the study of oppositional defiance. It then led to the ability to control the minds through mass hypnosis, which Open Sesame in the young times of the 60s led to an entire society that believed that they had somehow created or discovered a truth that was their own. And Ginsburg had told them that the electric Kool-Aid acid test and their bus was just a CIA catch and tag and release program. While he wasn't believed, eventually the Freedom of Information Act did prove that that was the case. So there are many examples of important philosophers that wrestled with these subjects using their own senses. However, they did start with education. Ram Dass, of course, very Ivy League. So it can be questioned, were these found or were they revealed? Also, I felt it important to mention the Grateful Dead. So many people seem to love the Grateful Dead, who used to be called the Warlocks, but they are part of the information campaign led by the American CIA in the 60s. So if you were to not follow your programming, if someone were to tell you that you had been part of MK Ultra or some related information, you were supposed to go insane, go rogue, and a self-destruct sequence would initiate. And there have been examples of agents going rogue and suiciding through bulletproof glass, which should be impossible, but shows what is possible with the mind. And there's a lot of hypnotic reactionaries to this day. You see them every day, everywhere you go, because of the media. And they respond on a level to vibrations and waves that are they precede the understanding of what it is they're upset about. They're simply upset at a level that is hormonal and perhaps radio. But this kind of training creates an entire class of non-playing characters who believe that they are the most diverse, and perhaps this is a perfect word, diversity, because it is the duoverse, the two, unanimity minus one. And if you take any meta, the quickest way to divide it, or the easiest way, is into two. Before you divide it into any more, you would divide it into two. And there's this concept of I and thou, which was part of Martin Buber's philosophy, of binary meta philosophy, of unanimity minus one. It is very diametric, very binary, very digital, very oppositional, and supportive at the same time. But it is not analog. It is not spectral. It is you ain't. So how many senses do you have? You might think 6 senses, right? Or 5 senses. But if you start to think about it, smelling and tasting and feeling, well, even eardrums and eye photonics are all sort of touch-based senses. And if you really think about that, you have one sense, that you're sort of this sea amoeba that is describing different ways of feeling. Remember that electrostatic means that you really can't touch anything, and you probably are making it all up. So you have no sense at all. But we may share one sense, and it's the concept of empathy, the 6th sense, awareness of how others feel, or how an understanding of how others and what others feel. And if you focus on that spiritual sense, you can discover and tune your other senses to better describe a more consistent, predictable reality.